Tickety tock. Down. One step down. A few more to go. There we go. All right. A few more to go. Hopefully everyone can hear me just fine, and we will get started here in just a second. Now that the YouTube stream is working, let people log in that way, and anyone else coming in through Zoom can come in when they're ready as well. And then we'll get started, because as much as I love teaching, I hate having to repeat myself. So I would hate for anyone to miss the intro and then wonder where we are. But we're not going to give it too long, because I also hate wasting time. All right, I think that should be enough for most people's computers to have caught up. And if not, well, that's why we record it, so that people can watch it at their leisure at other times. All right, so we are now picking up in Chayei Sarah. Our wonderful journey through the life of Abraham is coming to an end. And that means that we have a number of loose ends to take care of. The most important, of course, and which dominates the majority of this Torah portion, is the finding of a wife for Yitzchak, for Isaac. And Isaac, alone of the patriarchs, does not find his wife himself. Instead, it is arranged that the servant of Abraham will go back to Haran, find somebody from Abraham's extended family, or at least not from among the local Canaanites, and then bring her back to the land of Canaan to marry Yitzchak. So that is, of course, the bulk of the story. And we've talked about the characters of Rebecca. We've talked about the question of predestination, of choice, of whether it was a test of God or whether it was a test of character. We have talked all about that in previous discussions. Just go back and look through the catalog of Chayei Sarah, and you'll see much on that. But I want to talk about a different aspect, which is the final meeting between Rivka and Yitzchak. With all of the buildup for all of this section, with the back and forth, the talking to the family and everything that happened, we finally get, in the very end of chapter 24, we finally get, oh, somebody says there's no sound. Hold on a second. Anybody else is hearing me? Let me double check. My Zoom said it was working.
I can hear you, Rabbi.
Okay, Andre can hear me. And I'm trying to see if anybody else has sound on YouTube. It did come through for me a second ago. Let me check. I can hear myself through YouTube, which is always very disconcerting. So I'm going to advise the person who's having trouble with their sound to give a double check on their device, make sure that they've got their own volume turned up, that it's not muted or in some other way preventing them from hearing what's coming out. Hopefully that will take care of it. And if not, well, sometimes there's no accounting for technology. But as I was saying, and hopefully as is being recorded, when we finally have Rivka enter the land of Canaan and meet Yitzchak, we get none of the repeat. The servant had gone over and over and over all of the story of how he had met Rivka and how she was this perfect fulfillment of the test that he was putting out. But he doesn't bother explaining that to Isaac. They just get together and it's fine. So what's going on here? And what is the Torah trying to emphasize about Yitzchak at this moment? And so that's where we're going to be taking a look. So let's go ahead and take a look. We're going to start right at the end of chapter 24, verse 61. And as we'll see, we're going to pick up with Rivka leaving, but more importantly, what happens with Isaac in the next encounter. Rivka and her maids arose. They mounted the camels and went after the man, meaning following the servant of Abraham. And the servant took Rivka and went off. Now Yitzchak had gone out from where you come to the well of the living one, seeing me, for he had settled in the Negev. So we have Isaac settling in a particular place, and it's, of course, has this very meaningful name from the past stories that we have gone through. But verse 63 is where things really start happening. And Yitzchak went out to stroll in the field around the turning of sunset. He lifted up his eyes and saw, here, camels coming. And it's beautiful the way that Fox tries to capture the feeling of the Hebrew. V'hine, gemalim, ba'im, right here, look out, whoa, wow, camels, right? There is an element of surprise. There is an element of interruption. But that is, of course, contingent upon the whole strolling part at the beginning. And that's actually a little bit hard to know. Right, going out, Vayetze Yitzchak, that's perfectly fine. Isaac went out, although we'll talk about where he might have been leaving in a second. But Lasuach Basadeh is where we are going to scratch our heads. That he went out for a stroll. Well, as we're going to see, this word Lasuach is not so easily captured by the word stroll. Indeed, there is a lot of arguing about the word itself. So what was he doing in the field around that turning of the evening, around that end of the day? What exactly was happening here that was interrupted by his witnessing of the arrival of Rivka? That is something that needs to be unpacked. And it may sound trivial, but I'm going to sort of give away a bit of the game here. This is a critical turn of phrase that is used to teach us a great deal about our own daily activities. So if you're not quite familiar with it, that's okay. Don't be embarrassed. But chances are you are familiar with how our tradition understands this in context of personal practice, even if you don't know this is the origin. We'll leave that just as the whetting of the appetite for the commentaries. But let's go ahead and continue and see what happens after this moment. And Rivka lifted up her eyes, mirroring what Isaac had just did, and saw Yitzchak. So he looks up and sees the camels coming from a distance. She on the camels looks up and sees Isaac, and she got down from the camel and said to the servant, "Who is the man over there that is walking in the field to meet us?" The servant said, "That is my lord." So she took a veil and covered herself. So Rivka prepares to meet Isaac now that she has correctly identified that that's who it is. And she is noticing that he is walking in the field towards meeting us, and she can feel that there is a significance to him that is more than just the other farmers and shepherds they would have passed and the many, many miles of travel. There is something happening here, a spark, if you will. Verse 66, and the servant recounted to Yitzchak all the things that he had done. For the first time that he abbreviates it. We've repeated this already 3 times, and now in the 4th time, the most important time, we just get the synopsis of, he said it again. Yitzchak brought her, meaning Rivka, into the tent of Sarah, his mother, whom you will remember passed away at the beginning of this Torah portion. He took Rivka, and she became his wife, and he loved her. Thus was Yitzchak comforted after his mother. So it's an incredibly touching, incredibly powerful scene here at the end of the chapter of verse 67, where Isaac is not only finding a companion in Rivka, he is not only agreeable to being together with her, but that he is, for the first time, explicitly being said in Torah, he loves her. He is in love with her. She is more to him than just a economic partner in life, which was what many wives were in the ancient world, even in the modern world, unfortunately. Instead, he truly has a deep sense of affection for her. And finally, he is able to pull himself out of the despair that he had felt with the passing of his mother, Sarah, which, as I said, happened at the beginning of the Torah portion. So there is a sweetness, a gentleness, a lovingness, a sentimentality that is here in Isaac that is not often seen in many of the other stories. The Torah picks and chooses what to share about each of the patriarchs and matriarchs, and we don't always get as much of a glimpse in explicit detail into their emotional state. We often have to interpret their actions to understand their emotional state. But here we are given that blessing. Just as an aside, it's not the main focus of our discussion, but people have wondered sometimes, why doesn't the Torah tell us what everybody is thinking and feeling all the time, like a modern novel does? Wouldn't it be nice to have the insight into exactly what Abraham was thinking and planning before the Akedah, exactly what Rivka was thinking when she left, and all of those other details? And yes, we would love to have them, but the Torah is also reminding us that that's not the way life works. That I want to know what's the internal state of all the people around me in my own life, not just my family, but the wonderful people of my community. I can try to deduce from their behavior and what they say, what they are thinking and feeling. But as we all know, that is an imperfect window into somebody's soul. But it is the only window we have. And so the Torah gives us a comparable view of our ancestors to remind us that there is no easy way to access what somebody is feeling and thinking, that we have to gently try to peel back through their behaviors, through their statements, and through the other aspects of our relationship, what is actually going on inside of them. And that is nothing that is simple and nothing we should ever take for granted. Which is why we are going to study this little episode of Isaac in some detail. In fact, we're going to focus specifically on what Isaac was doing out in that field when he was, quote, strolling around, Lasuach Basadeh. What exactly was happening here? Because as we'll see, this can be very important and instructive. Before we dive into our commentary, as always, I will leave it open for any questions or comments that people would like to make on the general text we've read, and then we'll dive in. Going once, going twice, moving on. And for those of you that are on the time delay YouTube stream, as always, feel free to type a question in the chat, and when I'm able to see it, I will be happy to answer it, even if we have technically moved on for a minute or two. It's okay. All right. So let's talk about Isaac going out. Yitzchak went forth. Well, in general, if somebody goes forth, we kind of want to know where they're coming from. I mean, after all, we saw that, Rivka goes out, right? She is heading out and following the man, right? We get a, where is she from? She is from her house. Where is she going? She's going to Canaan, right? We can put a start and a finish on her journey. It makes perfect sense. And we have Isaac indeed moving from one place to another. But here in 63, we have him just going out. Now, we could just wave this away and say, oh, if Isaac's going out, that means that he is simply leaving his tent, right? He goes out for the day. We use that idiom in modern English all the time, and that is perfectly fine and acceptable as a shot, as a first run-through reading. However, our text would like, our commentaries would like to suggest that we look at it a little bit more deeply than that, because this is the first time we have seen Yitzchak since the Akedah. At the end of the Akedah, very famously, Isaac does not reappear, nor does Isaac appear in the narrative of the death of his mother and her burial. And Isaac is not there when the servant is being sent to find a bride. He is only now reappearing in the Torah text, and our commentaries tell us that that's significant. Seeing that the Torah does not specify from where he went out, our sages in Midrash have understood it to mean that he left Gan Eden, the Garden of Eden, where he had spent the last 3 years after undergoing the Akedah on Mount Moriah. So what is basically being described in the Midrash is that we shouldn't think that the act of the Akedah had no effect on him. That in fact, Isaac was severely shaken. Some talk about, near death or even passing over and then back, depending upon which interpretation you want to follow. And this is his reappearance in the land of the living, that he is finally restored to his strength and to his health, both physical and psychological, so that he is able to leave the protective care, if you will, of Gan Eden, the protective care of the hospital that he was being tended in. Now, that's nice, but that's not the focus. But I couldn't miss the opportunity to share that particular midrash, as it provides us with some sympathy for people that have gone through traumatic situations, and understanding that time is needed, even in the best of circumstances, to heal the wounds that someone has endured. But back to our wonderful lasuach, our word of the day that get used to it. So we're going to start with Rashbam. Rashbam is, of course, the grandson of the great scholar Rashi. Rashbam is also one that is very famous for his Peshat interpretation. He tries to truly be straightforward and contextual in his analysis. And this is what he says. The word lasuach is basically the same as siach hasadeh, which is taken from Genesis 2, the plants that grow in the field. So you can see that the word lasuach and siach are indeed very, very similar in construction, and therefore they must be similar in meaning. So what would that mean? That would mean that Yitzchak went out to plant useful vegetations, trees, etc., and to check the work of his employees. So with that in mind, we go back to our verse over here on verse 63. It would read a little bit differently. It would say that Isaac went out to invegetate in the field, to do the botanical duties of the field. That he was not just strolling, that he was acting purposefully. And Rashbam's explanation, of course, is that if the word siach means plants, then if we turn that into a verb, which lasuach is a verb, then it must be to plant things, or plant things in English as a verb as well, like planting a tree. You plant the plants. English does the same thing as Hebrew occasionally. And that is, in Rashbam's opinion, the simplest explanation, that Isaac is just out doing some work. However, as we're going to see, that is not a universal interpretation. We already saw that in Fox's translation, he preferred the phrase strolling. And as we're going to see, we're going to get a little further than that concept entirely. But Chizkuni is going to tell us a couple of versions. Lasuach basadeh, to the shrubs in the field. Here it's again going on the plant metaphor, and he's reminding us of what Rashbam just said. The word is familiar to us from Genesis 2:5, siach hasadeh, vegetation of the field. And another example, it is also familiar to us from Genesis 21:15, hachat achad hasichim, that when Hagar abandoned her son Ishmael, who was about to die, she placed him under one of the bushes. So this phrase, hasichim, siach, lasuach, clearly it's talking about vegetables, or vegetation, excuse me, a better English word. And therefore, we should imagine that Isaac was going out to be among the vegetation of the field. And whether he was constructively working on it, checking on the people who were planting or not, we don't know, says Chizkuni, but that should be our understanding. But Chizkuni also introduces to us that that is not the only way that this could be understood. An alternative exegesis, it is related to the word siach, right? It means that Yitzchak went into the field to converse, that he is actually there to talk. Now, who would he be talking to? Chizkuni imagines God, which would mean that this is actually another phrase for pray. Now, you may notice that Chizkuni is not bringing any explanation for that. Well, that is because at this stage in the story, he is relying, story of the commentaries, he is relying upon many, many generations of interpretation for that point, rather than bringing it. In fact, at this point, when Chizkuni lived, it would have been more common to say that Isaac was out praying in the field, rather than to say Isaac was out planting things in the field. And that's because this interpretation that Isaac was praying had become so universal that it took more effort to prove the vegetative interpretation than the praying one, even though, to be honest, the vegetative interpretation seems to have more linguistic support. And let's continue on this, and we'll see how we can justify this notion of it being a prayer in just a little bit. So Ibn Ezra comes back again with the word lasuach, meaning to walk among the trees. He again is on the side that this means that he was out among the foliage. And On the other hand, Rashi, who is, of course, the most famous commentary that most people are reading, says that lasuach means to pray. And he's basing that on the Midrash, Genesis Rabbah, and also bringing in a verse from Psalms 102, where it says, he pours out his prayer. Now, we're going to have to come back into more detail on that. And thankfully, we have Siftei Chachamim, which, as I've discussed in other classes, he is a super commentary, which means that his commentary is commentary on Rashi's commentary. So he comes to try and explain why Rashi says what he says, in order to help us make sense, because Rashi is very brief. Rashi is always like the PowerPoint notes. He doesn't usually go into extended paragraph explanation. And as such, Siftei Chachamim tries to fill it in, and he is very helpful here while also raising some very good questions. So we have this idea that lasuach means to pray, and he says, quoting Rashi, this is a term for prayer, as in he pours out his prayer. Now, there's a question, says Siftei Chachamim. For the verse Yishpoch Sicho, which is the line from Psalms 102 that Rashi is referring to, and we can see that phrase Sicho here that is used as the parallel word to lasuach, we can see that seems to mean prayer, maybe, because you're pouring out something, and he has a different conundrum here, because he says, well, how do we know that Sicho means that? Well, the Gemara, the Talmud in Avodah Zarah 7b, uses the verse from here, meaning from the story of Isaac, which says lasuach basadeh, as a source that siach means prayer. All right, so what's going on here? Because I admit that even with Siftei Chachamim's longer writing, it's not always clear to everyone what he's trying to challenge. He's saying, look, Rashi tells us that Psalm 102 uses this same word, and there it means prayer. So therefore, here in Genesis, it must also mean to pray. But, says Siftei Chachamim, if you look in the Talmud says, what does Yishpoch Sicho mean? What does Psalm 102 mean? What does that word Sicho? Well, in Genesis, lasuach basadeh means to pray. Therefore, in Psalms, it must mean to pray. Essentially, we have two different parts of rabbinic tradition, and each of them are using the opposite verse to prove the verse they're currently wrestling with as what it means. So it's like saying, well, x equals y because y equals x, but we haven't actually proved that relationship. All we've done is used each side to prove the other, but we never proved it independently of the two. So that seems very, well, unhelpful. It's, why am I right? Well, because Tom says that I'm right. Why does Tom say I'm right? Because I said Tom is right. Well, why am I right? Because Tom, it seems very circular. And Siftei Chachamim is pointing that out. Remember, as Jews, we don't shy away from pointing out apparent contradictions within our tradition and texts, because those apparent, very important word, contradictions are important toeholds with which we can climb in our understanding. So, how does this get answered? Well, answer number one comes from the Tosafot, one of the great commentaries on the Talmud that came during the Middle Ages. And they answer on Berachot 26b, which we're going to look at later, that this is the way of the Gemara. That's the way the Talmud works, right? Sometimes the Talmud will say A equals B, and then in another place they'll say B equals A, and that answers the question. We get a similar example of that from the Gemara in Megillah 13a, which proves that Esther was righteous because it is written about her in Esther 2. He brought up Hadassah, right? Hadassah is Esther's Hebrew name, and it is written in Zechariah, and he was standing among the Hadassim. Hadassim are the myrtles. That's why until very recently, many Jewish women were named myrtles in honor of the English translation of Esther's name. And just as in Zechariah 1:7, it refers to the righteous, so too in Esther's 2:7, right? So if it's righteous in Zechariah, then therefore, when it's talking about the myrtle in as Esther's name, that means she was righteous too. But the problem is that in Sanhedrin 93a, the Gemara brings the proof the other way around, meaning that how do we know that in Zechariah it's talking about people being righteous? Because in Esther we know that she was righteous, and therefore, because her name matches the word of the Hadassim in Zechariah, we can read from Esther to Zechariah. So now we've read from Zechariah to Esther, and we've read Esther back to Zechariah, but how do we know that it's any proof? Well, says the Tosafot, that's just what the Gemara does, right? It'll often use A to prove B and B to prove A and never give you an alternative proof, and that's just what it is. Siftei Chachamim is not happy with that answer, but this does not seem right to me. Always a powerful statement when criticizing such a great generation of scholars as the Tosafot. Rather, the answer is both verses are needed, meaning that it's not just A equals B and B equals A. There is something unique in A that we would miss if we only had B, and something unique in B that we would miss if we only had A. With Yishpoch Sicho alone, we would think that Siach means speech, not prayer, since that same verse already said Tefillah le'oni, right? So going back to Psalms, the verse there says in the beginning that it is the prayer of a poor person, of a downtrodden person, and therefore we've had the word prayer already once in the verse, and so siach, we might think, means just talking, pouring out the words generically, not necessarily prayerful words, and that it is only prayerful in context in Psalms because the beginning talks about prayer, and we shouldn't think that the word siach means prayer all the time. It could just mean conversation. But in Lasuach Basadeh, with whom was Yitzchak speaking, right? Because we have that same word in Genesis, we can't think it just means talking, because Isaac was alone. There's no other person around that he is talking to, which means that he must have been talking to somebody that wouldn't have been physically present in the story, meaning God, which means that it is a special kind of talking, but it's a talking to somebody that isn't physically there, meaning another human being. And that means that it is Isaac talking to God, which we also know as prayer. So because of the two elements from each, we get that. So necessarily then, he established Mincha, the afternoon prayer service. We're going to talk about that in much more detail in just a second. And if we flip it, and with Lasuach Basadeh alone, if we only had the verse from Genesis, but we didn't have any clarification from Psalms, we would think that Lasuach means, as it does in Demai, in the Mishnah, where we have Uvnot Suach, which are a type of fig. It's a type of foliage, right? A type of vegetative vegetables. That Yitzchak went for a walk among the trees in the field. Indeed, as we saw, many of our commentaries still think that's just what's going on, is he's just going for a stroll, and it happens to be among the trees of the field, that it is just another word for vegetation. This is why Rashi brings a proof from Yishpoch Sicho, meaning that by bringing the phrase from Psalms, which very clearly is talking about prayer, we therefore know that this indeed was a prayerful moment, not just a vegetative moment. So Siftei Chachamim very nicely tries to explain why we need this web of understanding. He demonstrates, I think, superbly, something that people often miss when they try to read text. They will read a text, they will think about what it means there on the page, and then think they are done. But really, we have to look at all the different meanings of similar words across the canvas of Tanakh to make sure that we can understand any one word in its actual location. That it's not as simple as, what does this mean here? There are layers of meaning that can only be understood by connecting all of the threads of similar type of wording. That's something that our sages did very well. They didn't always leave extensive notes on how they were doing it, which is why super commentaries like Siftei Chachamim are so helpful of pulling together those threads for everyone these days. All right, so the upshot is, there is good reason to believe that what Isaac was doing was some form of prayer, that it was not just he was out in the field, but that there is a prayerful element to this. Exactly how much of this word means prayer and how much means out in the fields, we can argue about. But it is very tenable to argue that this is talking about a prayerful experience. And that's good, because in the next section, taken from the Talmud in Brachot, we're going to talk about how Isaac has actually established the prayer service of Mincha. In fact, all of the patriarchs are said, as we'll see by Rabbi Yossi, to have established the different prayer services. As a reminder, we have 3 different prayer services every day. There is a shacharit prayer, that's the morning prayer. We have a mincha prayer, that is an afternoon prayer. And then we have a mariv or arvit prayer, which is the evening prayer. Those are the 3 prayer services that Jews do every day. And then, of course, we add one known as Musaf when it is Shabbat and holidays. Now, where did those services come from? As you may know, they are not explicitly described in the Torah. There is no mitzvah in the Torah that says explicitly, you will pray shacharit, mincha, and arvit, and then, done. Instead, we have to try and interpret. Now, this is obviously a common practice, even at the time of the Mishnah and the early days of rabbinic writings. It's clear that this was already an ongoing activity. And the question is, well, where did it come from? Well, Rabbi Yossi says that, son of Rabbi Hanina says, the prayers were instituted by the patriarchs, meaning Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, each instituted one of those 3. And we'll break that down in a second. But an opposing opinion says, Rabbi Yoshua ben Levi said, prayers were instituted based on the daily offerings, meaning the sacrifices of the temple. All right, let's see who has the best argument. So going back to Rabbi Yossi, the one who says that this is about the patriarchs, it was taught in accordance with Rabbi Yossi, son of Rabbi Hanina. Abraham instituted the morning prayer, as it is stated, and Abraham rose early in the morning to the place where he had stood before the Lord. Genesis 19. And standing, meaning that, standing before the Lord means nothing other than prayer. How do we know that? Because if you look at Psalms 106, and it's stated, and Pinchas stood up and prayed, and the plague ended. So by using a more explicit sentence with this word, which contains the notion of prayer, we are able to use that understanding to explain it here in Genesis 19, that when Abraham is standing, he is praying. And since the verse about Abraham talks about doing it early in the morning, bada bing, bada boom, Abraham created the prayer service of the morning, what we call shacharit. Please join us for shacharit on Saturday mornings and Sunday mornings at Temple Israel, which are at 9:30 and 9 o'clock respectively. But of course, also do shacharit on your own if you're not able to do it with your community. On to Isaac, the subject of our conversation mostly today. Isaac instituted the afternoon prayer. As it is stated, Isaac went out to converse, lasuach, in the field toward evening. Well, lasuach, the conversation, means nothing other than prayer. As it is stated, a prayer of the afflicted when he is faint and pours out his complaint, his sicho, his words, his meditations before the Lord. So as we talked about already from Sifrei Chachamim in more detail, that verse in Psalm 102 helps us unpack Genesis 24 to understand that it is talking about a prayerful moment, not just walking in the field. Moving on, because we've already talked about that quite a bit. Oh, sorry, and of course, that would establish the mincha, the afternoon service for our daily prayers. Jacob instituted the evening prayer, as it is stated, and he encountered the place and he slept there, for the sun had set. Obviously, we're talking about nighttime, but how do we know he's praying? Well, the word encounter means nothing other than prayer. As it is stated now from Jeremiah, when God spoke to Jeremiah, and you do not pray on behalf of this nation, and do not raise on their behalf the song and prayer, and do not encounter me, for I do not hear you. So obviously we have that usage of the same word encounter here with a prayerful element alongside of it. So therefore we are justified in interpreting the encountering of Jacob with the place, which happens to also be another name for God, and at the nighttime period, that this was also a prayer service known as Mariv, Arvit, which continues to be one of our 3 daily services today. All right, slam dunk arguments. We have nice textual proof for each of them. So therefore, that's why we have 3 prayer services. We're done. No, we're not. Never, because there is an alternative opinion. So as mentioned, it was taught in accordance with Rabbi Yoshua ben Levi. Why did the rabbis say that the morning prayer may be recited until noon? Which is one of the teachings of our sages, that Shacharit can only go up until 6 hours. Because although the daily morning offering is typically brought early in the morning, it may be sacrificed until noon. All right, so what is Rabbi Yoshua ben Levi doing? He is giving a justification for Shacharit, Mincha, Arvit based upon what happened in the temple. And his proof is not textual, his proof is halachic. He is saying, look, these prayer services have certain rules to them of when we do them. The only way to understand how they were established is to look at what rules govern their usage. And when we look at their rules, we don't see anything that would have a relationship to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. But we do see a very tight relationship with how the sacrifices in the temple took place. Therefore, we have to interpret that these services, the Shacharit, Mincha, Arvit, were established because they mapped onto the prayer services, the sacrificial services of the temple itself. And like he says, you can tell that by the way we put rules around them. We already know that you can technically do Shacharit very, very late. Why? Because you could technically do the morning offering very, very late. There is nothing in the story of Abraham that would teach us that, but the laws of the sacrifices make that very clear. Similarly, and why did the rabbis say that the afternoon prayer may be recited until the evening? Because the daily afternoon offering is sacrificed until the evening. And why did they say the evening prayer is not fixed, meaning there is no set time at all? Because the burning of the limbs and fats of the offering were not consumed by the fire on the altar until evening, meaning that they remained on the altar and were offered continuously throughout the entire night. That there was no set time for the evening destruction of the leftover limbs and fats, and therefore there is no set time for the nighttime service. Arvit can happen technically all the way through night, although we always try to get it done before midnight. But that is technically a precautionary limit. Technically, we can go further than that, just as the leftover pieces of the sacrifices could still be consumed all the way through the night. And again, you can't explain that by pointing to part of the story of Jacob, but you can explain it quite easily by pointing to how the sacrifices were conducted. And then, of course, the kicker. And why did the rabbi say that the additional prayer, Musaf, may be recited all day? Because the additional offering is brought throughout the entire day. And of course, we don't have a 4th patriarch to explain Musaf. And so this is a very compelling explanation. After all, why have a 4th prayer service on Shabbat and holidays when it wasn't instituted by a patriarch? But it's easy to explain having that 4th prayer service on Shabbat and holidays when we remember that there was an additional sacrifice brought on Shabbat and holidays. So Rabbi Yoshua ben Levi makes a very compelling argument. So what do we actually believe? I can hear people shouting at their computer. So which one is it, Rabbi? Well, it's both. That is the way that Judaism works. We have an understanding that roots ourselves in our prayer service that has a leg both into the deep history of our people, of the ancestors of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. And we see how each one of them was connected to that service. But we also have a leg firmly rooted within the services of the temple, which were so critical for our community and for our sense of being united. And really, by having these 2 pillars, they're not entirely in competition. Yes, we can argue about which one was the actually really, really first one and all of that. That's a less interesting argument in my opinion, but instead recognized how they complement each other by saying that you are not just alone like Abraham was, like Isaac was, like Jacob was in your prayers. Even as we imitate the cadence with which they approach God, we are also bound together as a community, the same way that the sacrifices of the temple bound together our community, and that our prayers should not be purely personal, but must also envelop the entire community, and where possible, be done with the entire community. So we shouldn't look at these as adversarial opinions. We should instead see them as being complementary. Now, before we go, even though we've sort of handled the main part of Isaac, I just wanted to bring another text about prayer in general, because there is a way to look at these three different proof texts about standing, conversing, encountering that we looked at back up in our Talmud text for each of the patriarchs. We can learn from them different insights about how to make our prayer and our relationship to God stronger. So couldn't pass up the opportunity, even if it's not technically parshanut, it's not technically just figuring out what our verses are saying. Instead, it's a little bit of a broader concept. So these three expressions in Brachot 26b, standing, conversing, and encounter, are aligned with three principles three principal benefits that prayer brings to the service of God. The first after prayer is to root firmly in the heart all the holy concepts and lofty images, the foundations of awe and morality which one has acquired in their soul, so that they will not falter under the storm winds which devastate morality and divine service through the desires of the heart and the passions of time. It's hard being out there, even when we have tried to elevate ourselves and understand better the ways of God and the nature of God. When we step out into the real world and actually deal with things, we often get blown off course, whether it be from our own appetites or whether it be from things around us. It's hard to keep that going. So how do we fight it? Well, we root ourselves firmly. And as he suggests, the primary time for this rooting is the morning. That before one turns to the business of life and the inevitable feelings of bodily desire, they prepare a strong and well-founded moral posture for themselves, which will stand up under the oppositional trials of the waves of the times. Therefore, the prayer which is oriented toward this activity is known as Amidah, standing, right? You are standing up against it. To this end, our father Abraham, first of the faithful, who withstood 10 wondrous trials, and against all the multitude that opposed the path which rises in the light of God, who stormed in order to scatter and push him aside, was most fit. He fought to find a well-founded and enduring place to stand. The argument is that Abraham is the symbol of standing against this tidal wave of the world. He himself stood against all these challenges. He himself stood against all of the challenges that came from others that tried to destroy this monotheism that he was bringing into the world. And of course, that personal moment of when we want to strengthen our ability to stand against these kinds of crises, that really is a morning time activity. We may need those things to be refreshed throughout the day, of course, but in the morning, if we get that good start before we set out, well, then we will be in a much better place. And thinking of Abraham, feeling that Shacharit is imitating his resiliency, not merely the timing of his prayer, but the specific strengthening of ourselves at that moment, like Abraham was strong throughout his life, is a powerful kavanah, a powerful intentionality that gets us ready for the rest of the day. Onward to Isaac, of course. Prayer is called sicha, conversation, sharing a name with plants and trees, which are called sichim, due to the blossoming of the soul with new powers, which branch out naturally through the excitation of the soul in the service of the heart. So a lovely bit of poetry, trying to say that the reason why this word for prayer and this word for plant are so similar is because it has to do with the blossoming of the soul, the soul flowering up, if you will, in the service of the heart, which is another term for prayer. This is most fit to the time of the mincha offering, the afternoon, when one is close to casting off their troubles. Then their soul can elevate her nature and the natural holy emotions stored up in her to join to the living God and overflow with this pure love and awe, increasing fertile fruit and sending out shoots and branches, taking the likeness of a mighty tree, one of these sichim, this vegetation. This natural blossoming from within the rightness of the soul is the root of the judgment which is passed upon the one who turns aside from the straight path of life. The attribute of judgment, insofar as it has a natural law, is exacting with one who changes its ways and strays from its path. And this is the attribute of Yitzchak, as it is written, were it not that God of my father, the God of Abraham, and the fear of Yitzchak had been with me, as our sages taught with thorough explanation. So Yitzchak has this notion of being a blossoming one, that just as in the afternoon, when we have finished almost all of the most difficult toil and trouble of the day, we are finally able to allow ourselves to fully blossom because we have dealt with what needed to be done and we have endured to reach that point, and our troubles are now fading into the rearview mirror by and large. We are able to lift ourselves up. Well, so too Isaac. First of all, he was living physically at that time, coming after the great troubles of Abraham, and then being in a slightly more settled state, although there's much debate and discussion on that, as some of my other classes discuss. But more importantly, it is this notion of the fear of Yitzchak, right? His awe, the way that he was in relationship with God, was one who would blossom in this straight way, strong and proud like this tree, because of his awe of God would prevent him from moving off of that path. This is what allows us to continue to grow forward, realizing that having a second generation that grows in the right direction is, up until this point in the Torah, unprecedented. We don't get this second generation of true flowering. So Yitzchak then, of course, is appropriate for that time of the afternoon. However, there is another great advantage to prayer, that she finds her essential purpose in those of the highest level and value, the highest holy ones who draw near to God, who rise up in prayer and lift themselves to the level of prophecy or near to it. As it is written in the Tur and Shulchan Aruch, they encounter states well beyond the ways of nature, because they are lifted up far beyond the natural condition and cleave to the living God in purity of heart and soul. Right? Prayer can make us not only endure what happens and not only blossom at the end of each day, but it can lift us even beyond the normal limits of this world. And the night is best suited for this, in its respite and solitude, as the Chassid explains in the Duties of the Heart, wonderful book if you haven't read it, on the advantage of nighttime prayer, which also facilitates visitation of sacred lofty visions and awesome intellectual fruits that cannot be apprehended in the company of the physical senses. There is a closing in of the world, a fading off of the world at night, when everything is shrouded in darkness and it is quiet, that allows for an understanding and apprehension that we don't get during the busyness of the day and during the flood of our senses around us during the day. Things grasped from beyond the conceptual processes embedded in nature come not according to the natural gradual order of simple to profound, or through individual analytic pathways gathered together in a framework. To really reach this level of what others might call enlightenment doesn't just come drip, 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 building it up gently. Instead, it's going to come differently. Rather, the great light of the sweetness of God is revealed suddenly. Happy is the one who merits to it. Prayer is called encounter, as when one happens upon something, as a result not only of the nature of the path which the traveler takes, you have to be pointed in the right direction in the first place, but also of the imminent nearness of the one encountered. Suddenly, you're there. And so it was for our father Yaakov. For it is a certainty that his prayer prepared him for the lofty prophetic vision of the ladder and all its particulars. He laid down having left his home. And this is why the name encounter, that this Pgia, is associated with his prayer, and he encountered the place. This is befitting the nighttime prayer. So this essay is trying to get us to think that prayer is going to be experienced differently at different times. There is a mood for shacharit, a mood for mincha, a mood for the evening, and there are different possibilities and different goals in mind for each of those experiences. And that is something that, by holding on to this notion of our ancestors, by holding on to the link through the great communal temple, by holding on to the different potentials of each time that we approach God in prayer, we can make it a powerful and meaningful experience. I know that prayer does not come as easily as people always make it sound. It's always funny that everyone thinks that prayer comes easily, but if you ask them individually, they all know it doesn't. And this hopefully will give you a little bit more of a hook with which to prepare yourself before participating in a shacharit, mincha, or arvit service, in order to be able to hopefully tap into something a little bit more than just the recitation of the words. Those words are a great start, but they must be the beginning rather than the end of our participation. And with that, I will open it up for any other questions or comments. Give a little pause for our YouTubers. And if not, I will remind everybody that we have one more time for conversation tonight. This is on Wednesday, the 20th of November. And then we'll be on a little bit of a pause before we begin the new Wednesday night program. I will also remind you that next Wednesday, we do not meet for our Torah study because, well, everything's a little crazy the day before Thanksgiving. So please make sure that you feast individually on your Torah study, as well as hopefully giving thanks. Whether you're from a country or community where Thanksgiving is important, certainly in Judaism, the idea of giving thanks is central. And I hope that you have a wonderful holiday together in whichever way you celebrate. Take care, everyone, and be well.